Attila, a name that for centuries sounded like a harbinger of doom. He was feared not only by common peasants, but by emperors as well. He was called the Scourge of God, the destroyer of cities, a shadow encroaching from the east. But who was he, really? Where did the legend begin, and where did history end? In this video, you will hear the complete chronicle of his life, from a mysterious childhood in the heart of the steppes to the final wedding night that became the beginning of the end. The story of Attila often begins when he is already at the head of countless hordes, burning cities and demanding gold from emperors bowed at his saddle. But the image of the conqueror, nicknamed the Scourge of God, was not born overnight. It grows from the steppe, from the wind, from the cry of birds and the smell of the campfire. And to understand what this man was like, we must go back to his childhood, to a world where walls did not yet separate people from the land, and power was measured not by seals and laws, but by the speed of a horse, a drawn bowstring, and loyalty to one's kin. Attila's exact date of birth is unknown, but historians agree that it occurred at the very end of the 4th century AD, probably around the 390s. His people, the Huns, had by this time already penetrated the western frontiers of Europe and become a fearsome name for many tribes inhabiting the steppes between the Volga and the Danube. Few wrote about the origins of the Huns, and those who did were mostly their enemies. Roman chroniclers like Ammianus Marcellinus depicted them as almost inhuman creatures, without architecture, writing, or pity. But behind this fear was a vibrant, complex, and whole culture, with its own customs, laws, clans, legends, and concepts of honor. The Huns were descendants of nomadic peoples who came from the east, possibly from Central Asia. Their language remains a mystery to historians, but their style of warfare, lightning-fast raids, composite bows, light cavalry, became legendary. From an early age, boys in Hunnic families grew up not among toys, but among horses and weapons. It was said of infants that they learned to sit in the saddle before they could stand firmly on their feet. The horse became an extension of the body, and the arrow, a thought flung forward. The name of Attila's mother has not survived, nor has the exact name of his father. Later chronicles mention that he belonged to a noble clan, possibly among the war chiefs who participated in early clashes with the Goths and Alans. The boy grew up in a world where a tent was a home and the horizon was the limit of a dream. The morning began with weapons practice, the day with hunting, the evening with the stories of the elders. The songs sung around the campfires did not praise gods, but glorified ancestors, battles, and victories. It was through these songs that a sense of duty, of ancestral memory was formed. The idea that each person is just a link in a long chain, and his actions will be judged by his descendants. From an early age, Attila showed what would later become his distinguishing trait. He was an observer. He rarely interfered in the conversations of his elders, but remembered everything. Who was friends with whom, who envied whom, who was lying, and who was silent out of caution. Once, while still a teenager, he accompanied his father to a meeting with a Gothic delegation that had arrived at the Danube for negotiations. After the meeting, while everyone was discussing what had been said, he noted that the Gothic chief kept his hand under his cloak the entire time. He drew no conclusions from this, but he remembered. And, as it was said later, he always noticed the small details that others missed. This was not mere attentiveness, but a special intuition for weakness and hidden intent. Even in his youth, he commanded respect from warriors not with his strength, but with his confidence. He did not shout, did not compete in noisy games, and did not strive for ostentatious bravery. He was respected for his silence, his restraint, for a gaze that held something heavy and deep, like the steppe at night. He had few friends, but many supporters.
His tribesmen, and especially his cousins, knew he did not forgive twice. According to the Byzantine historian Priscus, the Huns trained their children for resilience from an early age. They were laid on animal skins in winter and doused with cold water so that the body would get used to pain from infancy. Initiation wounds were inflicted intentionally so the skin would become accustomed to cuts and burns. These practices were commonplace, and boys who did not undergo them were not allowed to bear arms. Attila not only endured them, he accepted them with a silent determination, not from fear of being rejected, but because he knew it was the path the strongest followed. History has not preserved stories of his first battles, but it is known that even before the age of 20, he accompanied his elders on campaigns, first against neighboring tribes, then in raids on the outskirts of Roman territories. He saw how the elders behaved in battle, how they divided spoils, how they betrayed allies, and how they killed prisoners. This was not a school of honor, but a school of power, where survival belongs to the one who understands the rules before they are spoken aloud. He grew up in a pivotal era. The empires were trembling. The Western Roman Empire was losing cities one after another. The Eastern Empire was paying gold for peace. The barbarians were no longer knocking at the gates, they were living inside. Attila knew this, and at some point he realized that whoever could unite the barbarians would be stronger than those who feared them. By the end of his youth, Attila's name had become known among the nomadic tribes. He was not called a king, but he was already recognized as a leader. He did not yet command armies, but he already had the right to speak on behalf of his clan. In the tents, whispers began that he would be the first of those who would not just take tribute, but take power. And although he did not yet wear a crown or sit on a throne, he already knew that the steppe was waiting for its master. When an old chieftain dies, the steppe does not fall silent. It listens, and into this silence a question inevitably arises for which there is no pre-written answer. Who will now lead the people forward? Who will keep the tent from collapsing, the warriors from internecine slaughter, the alliance from breaking apart? The Huns had no throne, no crown, and no right of primogeniture sanctified by a book or a church. Where there were no written laws, power was determined by strength, respect, and the ability to hold the union together not through fear, but through necessity. When the chieftain Rua, Attila's uncle, died at the very beginning of the 5th century, many expected the Hunnic union to fall apart, but it did not. Instead of civil strife, a form of rule strange to the nomadic world emerged, a diarchy. The union came to be led by 2 nephews of the late ruler, Attila and his brother Bleda. They did not divide lands, but responsibility. It was not a division of power by territory, but rather by direction and character. From the beginning, Attila gravitated toward diplomacy, observation, and strategic moves, while Bleda leaned toward pleasures, demonstrations of strength and wealth. But in the first years of their rule, there was no open conflict. On the contrary, the alliance of the 2 brothers proved to be unexpectedly strong. Information about Bleda is fragmentary and comes largely from Byzantine authors, particularly Priscus of Panium, who would later meet Attila in person. From these descriptions, it can be surmised that Bleda was the elder of the 2 brothers, but was inferior to Attila in restraint and calculation.
Nevertheless, it was during the years of their joint rule that the Huns transformed from a disparate military alliance into a force capable of dictating terms to the Eastern Roman Empire. The brothers' first priority was to consolidate Hunnic influence within the steppe alliance itself. They used both violence and diplomacy. Some tribes submitted voluntarily, others were subdued after demonstrative punitive campaigns. An example of this is the story of one of the Alanic clans living between the upper reaches of the Don and the Volga. When negotiations for an alliance failed, Bleda led a military campaign. The war was swift and brutal.
After the victory, the prisoners were not slaughtered. Instead, the elders were invited to a council. They were offered not subjugation, but participation. In exchange for military service, they were granted the right to preserve their customs and lands. This step became a model for the future policy of the Hunnic Union, not to destroy completely, but to draw them into the common system. In those same years, the Huns established themselves in the territory of Pannonia, modern-day Hungary. Here, at the crossroads of the steppes and Roman roads, a permanent center emerged. Not yet a capital in the usual sense, but already a headquarters where intelligence, captives, tribute, and weapons flowed. The location allowed them to control the route to the Balkans and the West, and its proximity to the Roman Empire's borders made it strategically advantageous. It housed storehouses, workshops, and a treasury. Ambassadors and tribute bearers flocked here. A key moment in the strengthening of the Hunnic state was its diplomacy with the Eastern Roman Empire. During the 440s, Attila and Bleda managed to achieve from Emperor Theodosius II what no chieftain had before. In the city of Margis on the banks of the Danube, a treaty was concluded under which Byzantium pledged to pay the Huns an annual tribute of hundreds of pounds of gold. In addition, it pledged not to harbor fugitive prisoners, to allow Hunnic merchants access to its markets, and to prosecute spies operating against the steppe tribes. Priscus of Panium, one of the Byzantine ambassadors, left a rare and valuable description of those negotiations. He wrote that the Huns' behavior surprised the Romans. They were rude in appearance, but precise in their speech, and, despite their nomadic lifestyle, they conducted business with a calculation worthy of any imperial official. Attila, although seated on a simple wooden throne, already stood out among all present for his restraint, clear speech, and perceptiveness. The peace established by this treaty did not last long. Just 2 years later, the Huns undertook new campaigns into Thrace and Moesia. But these invasions were not the result of greed, but part of a clear strategy of pressure. The goal was not destruction, but a demonstration that peace costs money. In 43 and 44, Hunnic detachments reached the walls of cities, demanding ransom and new concessions. The empire once again agreed, increasing the payments to 1,000 pounds of gold per year. For comparison, this was equivalent to the annual salary of an entire legion. Against the backdrop of these foreign policy successes, Attila and Bleda continued to expand the internal structure of their union. Now at their disposal were not only Huns, but also conquered or voluntarily joined peoples: Ostrogoths, some Slavic clans, Sarmatians, and Bulgars. Each of these peoples retained its culture, but was obliged to provide warriors, pay tribute, and recognize the supremacy of the two rulers. Within the power structure itself, a redistribution of influence began to occur. Although the brothers formally ruled together, gradually more and more initiatives came from Attila. He established contact with Byzantine officials, sent embassies, and formed his own personal guard, which included warriors from different tribes. His word began to carry more weight, his name to sound louder.
He himself behaved with restraint, not seeking to sideline his brother. However, in the Council of Elders, there was no longer any doubt as to which of the two brothers saw further. Priscus had the opportunity to see their headquarters firsthand. He describes a simple, almost ascetic setting. Wooden houses, coarse fabric carpets, warriors sitting on the ground, and a silence broken only by the chieftain's voice. He notes that Attila wore simple, unadorned clothing, ate the same food as his warriors, and did not tolerate excess. And at the same time, every gesture of this man commanded silence. He was listened to even when he was silent. This was a time of formation, a time when two brothers held in their hands a fragile but strong union. A time when the Huns ceased to be just a tribe and began to transform into a force capable not just of attacking, but of conducting policy. A time when one of them had already begun to rise above the other. In the steppe, people do not die under cathedral vaults, not to the whisper of gospel prayers, and not on soft pillows surrounded by grandchildren. Here, death is always movement, an explosion, a change, and it is rarely natural, especially if a chieftain dies.
And if it is not just a chieftain who dies, but a brother, the steppe falls still to hear which of the living will be the first to speak. Bleda, Attila's brother and co-ruler of the Hunnic Union, disappeared from the chronicles unexpectedly. This happened in the mid-440s. Not a single written record has preserved the exact date, the circumstances, the name of the killer, or even certainty that he was actually murdered. Roman authors merely mention that Attila became the sole ruler after his brother's death, while Byzantine chroniclers, among whom Priscus of Panium particularly stands out, provide only rumors. Some said Bleda died from a hunting wound. Others claimed he was stabbed during a feast. Some told of a quarrel between the brothers, after which Attila allegedly struck the blow himself. None of these versions are confirmed, but they all point to one thing. Bleda's disappearance was not accidental. Attila's silence after his brother's death only heightened the anxiety. There was no public mourning, no search for culprits, no speech by the campfire. Attila's policy in the first months after establishing his sole rule was not aggressive but calculated. He did not carry out mass purges, did not reverse decisions made with his brother, did not tear down tents, and did not radically change the system. He reaffirmed previously concluded alliances, distributed powers among the elders, and left military leaders in place, even those who had once been more loyal to his brother. At the same time, he consistently gathered all the strings of power into his own hands. He sent messengers with gifts and orders to trusted clans, summoned those who had previously kept their distance, and offered them a place not beside him, but under him. One of the clearest signs of change was the structure of his personal guard. Whereas before it was formed mainly from representatives of his own clan, now warriors from the Gepids, Alans, and Goths began to join it, but only those who swore allegiance personally to the chieftain, bypassing their tribal ties. This was the first step toward creating a supra-tribal core of power. The men who served Attila directly did not depend on the decisions of their clans and were not subject to the customs of blood. They answered only to him. In the tents where the elders gathered, discussions were now rarely heard. More and more, the meetings turned into listening sessions. Attila listened patiently, without interrupting, but his word was always the last. He did not demand a formal title, did not call himself a king, did not declare himself a god. And therein lay his strength. He was the chieftain because no one could oppose him. He was the ruler because those who might have challenged him were either no longer breathing or stood beside him in complete silence. Around these same years, a system resembling a central administration began to be built. In Pannonia, on the banks of the Tisa, a permanent headquarters was established. Stone walls were not erected, but wooden fortifications, workshops, and reception rooms for ambassadors were built. Externally, it all resembled an ordinary steppe camp, but inside, systematic work was already underway. Tribute flowed here, captive craftsmen were kept here, decisions were made, messengers were dispatched, and future actions were planned. One ambassador who visited the headquarters described the chieftain as follows. He spoke briefly, but every word had weight. He wore simple clothes, but no one dared to look at him askance. He ate the same food as his bodyguards, but they did not eat until he touched his food. Attila did not strive for total centralization. He knew that the people of the steppe would not tolerate a rigid hierarchy, but he knew something else too. If you cannot rule a tribe through fear, rule it through obligation. He formed new connections, forged marriage alliances, and gave his daughters and sisters to the warlords of allied peoples. He invited the sons of elders to his court and kept them with him, supposedly as students, but in reality as hostages. He created an invisible network of influence, in which every tribal chief found himself bound by duties, fear, ambition, and calculation. Among his closest associates, figures appeared whose names would become known later. They were not just advisors, but executors of his will, who acted quickly, silently, and effectively. Through them, Attila established control over logistics, intelligence, negotiations, supplies, and tribute. He did not know writing, but he remembered perfectly who had promised how much, who had paid when, who was late and who had lied. By the end of the 440s, it became obvious Attila had not just outlived his brother, he had created a new model of power. He was not the head of a tribe, but the architect of a union. He did not just stand above an army, he was the heart and brain of the entire structure. None of the preceding chieftains had possessed such a fullness of influence, but he was in no hurry to enter into direct conflict with Rome. He knew that before striking, his name had to precede his sword. He was called the Lord of the Huns, the Master of the Steppes, the Terror of the Frontiers, but he himself had not yet said what would come next. And now, having become the sole ruler, he was ready to say it. By the time Attila had finally consolidated power in his own hands, the Eastern Roman Empire maintained only an outward impression of stability. The walls of Constantinople stood unshaken, the domes of its churches gleamed in the sun, and the bureaucratic apparatus continued to produce orders, reports, and sentences. But all this had long ceased to reflect the real state of affairs. Beyond the capital's walls, provinces were emptying. Roads were falling into disrepair, taxes were collected with difficulty, and garrisons were weakened by a lack of soldiers and discipline. Raids constantly flared up on the northern frontiers, and, increasingly, a name that sowed panic appeared in dispatches. He did not attack suddenly. His strategy was strikingly rational. Instead of unleashing his army on the border, he began with observation. His men, dressed as merchants or messengers, infiltrated the markets of border towns, gathered rumors, assessed the amount of grain in the granaries, and memorized the locations of guard posts. From this information, he compiled a map of weak spots, not geographical ones, but human ones. He looked not for breaches in the walls, but for cracks in their fear. Around the year 444, the first coordinated offensives began. The army assembled by Attila consisted not only of Huns. Under his banner gathered tribes of Alans, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Slavs, Bulgars, and Sarmatians. Their numbers are not reliably known, but Byzantine chroniclers wrote of tens of thousands of horsemen. The main thing that distinguished this army was its speed. Advanced detachments could cover a distance that would take a Roman army weeks in just a few days. They did not need roads, did not wait for supply trains, lived off the land and moved by instinct, but always on command. The first blow fell on the territory of Illyricum. The Hunnic army ravaged villages, burned storehouses, and took captives, but there was a system to this chaos. One of the cities, Nisus, modern-day Nish, was captured, partially plundered, and its surviving inhabitants were expelled. They were ordered to go to other cities and tell what they had seen. This action was aimed not at annihilation, but at spreading fear. The Huns used panic as a weapon of destruction. They didn't just burn buildings, they burned confidence. Simultaneously, Hunnic detachments penetrated the provinces of Thrace and Moesia. Their goal was not to hold the captured lands. On the contrary, they wanted Rome to feel that it could not hold anything. They took ransom, destroyed strategic warehouses, ruined fields, and left, leaving a void behind them. The empire could not catch them, could not defend against them, and most importantly, could not predict where they would appear next. One of the most alarming reports to the Byzantine Senate is dated to the spring of 45. It stated, "Our enemies do not demand battle, they demand the memory of fear. They are not interested in victory, they are interested in presence." This was an accurate observation. Attila did not seek open battles. He did not wish to conquer Constantinople. He needed the empire to pay in gold, in fear, in attention. In one city, whose name the chroniclers did not record, Attila sent an embassy instead of an army. His messengers entered the city gates and handed the elders just one object, a whip, decorated with silver. When asked the meaning of the gift, they replied, "If you do not wish to pay with gold, you will pay with this." The city surrendered without a fight, paid the required sum, and the Huns did not even enter. This incident became known far beyond the region and began to turn Attila's name into the personification not of destruction, but of absolute submission. But behind these actions was not just a threat. Attila carefully observed the consequences of his steps. He knew that if a city was plundered, merchants would not return. If villages were burned, taxes would disappear. If peasants fled, there would be no one to feed the enemy's army. He struck at the structure, at the organism of the empire, not at its facades. His enemy was not the army, but the very idea of a stable order. At the same time, within the Hunnic camp, a phenomenon astonishing for the barbarian world was observed: discipline. According to the memoirs of Priscus of Panium, who visited the Hunnic headquarters, every man knew his place. Disobeying an order was punished immediately. Theft meant death, and disobedience exile. Detachments set out precisely, returned on time, and maintained their designated order. He wrote, "They did not know writing, but they knew order. They did not write down decisions, but no one forgot them. The army was managed not through constant shouting and threats, but through a system of personal loyalty." Attila created a circle of devoted commanders around him, each responsible not only for the combat readiness, but also for the morale of their units.
These commanders were often from other tribes, and it was by this means that Attila achieved control. He placed side by side those who did not trust each other, but who trusted him. It was an alliance built on fear, respect, and calculation. Byzantine chroniclers began to call him the Scourge of God, an expression that later became legendary. Its origin is not entirely clear. Perhaps it emerged as a way to comprehend the disasters sent for the empire's sins. Perhaps it was a deliberate move by church propaganda, seeking a religious explanation for the defeats. But Attila did not object. He did not demand divine status, but he accepted the role of a punishment if it inspired terror. And yet, despite the scale of the invasions, he was in no hurry to conquer. He created an image around himself of a force that could come but does not, that could destroy but waits. It was a war of anticipation, and in it, Rome was losing without a single battle. When the sword falls silent, words come into play. And when words go hand in hand with a threat, diplomacy becomes the art of fear. Attila understood this better than most. He did not seek to destroy Rome. He sought to place it in the position of a perpetual debtor. And his strategy consisted not only of battles, but of forcing the empire to pay, not for defeat, but for the chance to postpone it. After the devastating raids on Thrace and Moesia, the Eastern Roman Empire, weakened by internal strife and constant threats from barbarians, entered into negotiations. The meeting place was the city of Margus, situated on the southern bank of the Danube near the border of Hunnic influence. The Byzantine delegation was led by an experienced official named Prudentius, a man who possessed not only a good knowledge of Latin and rhetoric, but also a clear understanding that he was facing not just barbarians, but a political force that knew how to bargain and retaliate. Attila's demands were clear and well thought out. He requested an increase in the annual tribute, the extradition of all Hunnic fugitives hiding in the empire's territory, the provision of duty-free trade along the border rivers, and the punishment of a bishop from Margus itself, who, the Huns claimed, had desecrated an ancient sanctuary on their territory. This last point was not so much political as it was sacred. It was an insult that required atonement. Prudentius, seeking to avoid war, agreed to everything, even the extradition of the bishop. He was publicly handed over to the Huns and was soon executed without a formal trial. Thus, the Eastern Roman Empire demonstrated that, for the sake of peace, it was willing to sacrifice not only its money, but also its clergy. From that moment on, the negotiations ceased to be between equals.
Attila realized he could demand more. Under the terms of the treaty concluded at Margus, Byzantium pledged to pay the Huns an annual tribute of 1,000 pounds of gold, to open trading posts along the entire Danube border, to hand over all runaway slaves and deserters, and most importantly, to recognize the territorial claims of the Huns in the region north of the Danube. In return, Attila pledged not to cross the border, but this formula was cunningly worded. He did not promise not to attack. He promised not to cross the river as long as he received everything he wanted. Some in Constantinople considered this a diplomatic victory, but among those who truly understood the nature of the threat, it was clear this was a postponement, not a solution. One such person was far away in Italy. His name was Flavius Aetius. Flavius was a Roman general, a man called the last of the Romans. In his youth, he had spent several years among the Huns as a hostage, learning their language, customs, and horsemanship, and even participating in their battles. It was thanks to this experience that he knew the Huns were not just steppe horsemen.
They were an army with discipline, with a leader possessing strategic thinking, and with a political goal. Aetius understood that the gold Attila was now receiving would not be spent. He was hoarding it. There was no open enmity between Aetius and Attila, but both understood they were on a collision course. On more than one occasion, they exchanged letters, brief, harsh, and filled with cold courtesy. Once, Attila wrote, "You have not forgotten what I taught you in your youth, have you? And so you know that I will come." Aetius did not reply in writing, but he began to strengthen alliances with barbarian tribes, reinforce garrisons in Gaul, and gather intelligence on the size of the Hunnic army. Over the next few years, Byzantium continued to pay tribute. According to various estimates, the total sum paid over 5 years exceeded 5,000 pounds of gold. However, this was not enough for Attila. He perceived each payment not as a transaction, but as a gesture of submission. And as soon as Rome delayed a payment or tried to dispute the terms, Attila would threaten a campaign. In parallel, he began to build his political network in the west. Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, Alemanni, all of them sparked his interest. He did not seek to attack immediately, but he closely watched for changes in their politics. He knew that if the Romans ever tried to refuse to pay, he would have to remind them of the price of fear. Meanwhile, Attila's headquarters in Pannonia was turning into a center of power. Gold flowed there from both empires. Captive craftsmen built fortifications, forged weapons, and crafted armor. Everything Rome had given up for peace was now becoming a weapon that would one day be turned against it. But even this accumulation of wealth was not the goal. The goal was the submission not only of lands, but of minds. Attila wanted to be feared not when he was at the gates, but when he was simply mentioned, for his name to signify the movement of gold, for him to become a figure who could not be ignored, neither on the battlefield nor at the council table. When gold no longer keeps the sword in its sheath, war replaces peaceful negotiations. Attila had patiently collected ransom, received ambassadors, and tested the weaknesses of the empires. But his entire tactic was premised on a moment when words would no longer matter. He knew that fear had to be renewed, otherwise it would weaken, like a sound fading into an echo. And so when his power reached its apex, he led his army into the very heart of the Western Roman Empire, Gaul. By the beginning of the year 451, the Hunnic state covered a vast expanse of Central Europe. Under Attila's command were not only the Huns themselves, but also vassal tribes. They were united not by culture, faith, or language. They were bound by fear of the supreme chieftain, who tolerated no disobedience and rewarded the loyal. On the opposite side, in Italy,
remained the only man capable of organizing resistance, Flavius Aetius. He understood that a direct strike on Italy was not yet advantageous for Attila, too close to the Eastern Empire. But Gaul, fragmented, weakened, long dreaming of oblivion, had to be defended at any cost. The pretext came unexpectedly. The sister of the Western Roman Emperor, Honoria, finding herself in exile, sent Attila a letter asking for protection from a forced marriage. Along with the letter, she sent her ring. Attila interpreted this gesture as a proposal of marriage and, citing the rights of a groom, demanded half of the empire as a dowry. Emperor Valentinian III refused. That was enough. In the spring of 51, Attila crossed the Rhine. His army, according to contemporary estimates, numbered between 60,000 and 80,000 men, predominantly cavalry. Metz fell first, followed by Reims. The Huns did not linger in the ruined cities. They moved forward like an avalanche.
Their target was Orléans, a major commercial and strategic center. The city held out staunchly, but every night the walls were shaken by the blows of siege engines, and news of relief came less and less often. Meanwhile, Aetius began to gather his forces. He called upon the Visigoths, who lived in the south of Gaul, persuaded the Franks and Alans to join the alliance, and drew in all available garrisons, remnants of Roman legions, and even individual commanders who had previously been enemies. His task was simple. If Attila was not stopped now, no one would stop him. In total, he commanded about 60,000 men. The battle took place on the Catalonian plains, not far from the modern city of Troyes. It was a place where the steppe met the plain, suitable for maneuvers but giving no advantage to either side. The day of the battle was in mid-June. According to legend, the sun was not yet at its zenith when the Visigoth vanguard clashed with the forward detachments of the Gepids. The impact was brutal, and soon the entire plain was covered in dust, screams, and blood. The battle raged until late evening. The Huns attacked the center, hoping to break the ranks of the Alans, who were covering the Roman flank. Aetius commanded from a hill, sending troops wherever the front began to buckle. The Gothic king, Theodoric, fell in battle. According to one version, he was thrown from his horse and trampled by his own warriors. Despite this, his son Thorismund managed to hold the army together and even launched a counterattack on the Huns' right flank. When night fell, the field was strewn with bodies. Neither side could claim victory, but Attila did not advance. In the morning, he did not renew the attack. Instead, he began a retreat, slow, organized, without panic. His supply train was not captured, his commanders had not fallen, his cavalry remained intact, but he left, and this was seen as his first failure. Aetius did not pursue the retreating enemy. He understood that a victory on the field did not mean a victory in the war. The alliance he had assembled was fragile, full of internal contradictions. He did not want the Visigoths to become stronger than Rome. He let them go south. He allowed Attila to leave, knowing that he would return. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains became one of the bloodiest battles of late antiquity. According to chroniclers, at least 20,000 men fell that day. But the main point was not the number of casualties, but the fact that for the first time, Attila was stopped. Not defeated, but stopped. He returned to Pannonia. He was not pursued, but he was remembered. Now he knew that for a final victory over Rome, he needed to strike at its heart, and the following year, he would lead his army into Italy. After the Catalonian plains, where Attila failed to achieve victory, he lost neither his army, nor his authority, nor his desire to continue the offensive. He knew that his return to Pannonia was not a capitulation. He saw his retreat as a temporary regrouping, a maneuver to be followed by a new strike, more precise and dangerous than before. He understood that if Gaul could not be taken by force, then Italy, deprived of allies, internally weakened and politically fragmented, would be a far more vulnerable target. In the spring of the year 452, Attila again led his army on a campaign. This time, the path lay south, through the Alps, along the Adriatic coast.
into lands that still held memories of Caesar, Augustus, and Trajan and their legions, but which no longer had the strength to resist. The first city to bear the brunt of the attack was Aquileia, one of the largest and most important centers of northern Italy, a city that served as a key commercial and defensive hub. Attila, as was his custom, first sent messengers, offering the city a chance to surrender, pay a ransom, and open its gates. There was no reply, so he ordered the siege to begin.
The city resisted stubbornly. The walls were high, the garrison prepared, the inhabitants full of resolve. The siege dragged on for several weeks. The Huns used siege towers, surrounded the city with ditches, burned the surrounding villages, and cut off all supply routes. A later legend claims that during the battle, an arrow, shot at random, hit a wooden beam supporting part of the wall, causing the fortification to collapse. There is no historical confirmation for this scene, but it is known that the defense eventually crumbled. Attila broke through, and the city was put to the torch. The destruction of Aquileia became a symbol. Its walls, houses, temples, archives, everything was destroyed. Many historians believe that after this blow, Aquileia never recovered its former importance. The chronicler Jordanus wrote that only a shadow remained of the city upon the ashes. The inhabitants, who did not die and were not taken captive, scattered into the marshes and lagoons of the Adriatic. It was then, according to tradition, that the settlement of the islands where Venice would later rise began. After Aquileia followed Patavium, Altinum, Concordia, and many other cities in northern Italy. Even those who had previously held out to the last retreated. One by one, strongholds fell, and no one doubted that the road to Rome was open. Panic gripped the peninsula. Emperor Valentinian III, lacking both decisiveness and a sufficient army, effectively abandoned the capital to its fate. The Senate was paralyzed. The remnants of the army had either scattered or were not assembled in time. The only one who dared to act was a bishop, Leo, who would later go down in history as Pope Leo I. Leo had no army, no fortresses, no right to give orders, but he had his word, and he decided to use it. He went to meet Attila, accompanied not by legions, but only by a few close associates, a prefect and one of the former consuls. What exactly happened at this meeting remains a mystery. Some sources claim that the Pope addressed the chieftain with a speech in which he urged him to spare the eternal city for the sake of future glory and eternal memory. Later Christian legends asserted that during his conversation with Attila, the archangel Michael appeared above Leo with a drawn sword, and Attila retreated, terrified by divine intervention. More rational explanations point to the fact that at the same time, news arrived from the east of an impending campaign by Emperor Marcian, while famine and an epidemic began to spread within Italy. Whatever the case, the fact remains Attila did not march on Rome. He turned his army around and returned to Pannonia. And for Rome, this was a miracle, because for the first time it was saved not by swords or walls, but by a voice, the voice of an old man in white. Pope Leo returned to Rome as a victor, though not a drop of blood had been shed. He was hailed as a savior, as an angel. He became a symbol of the power of the word, which had become a shield. As for Attila, he returned to his headquarters, leaving behind not ruin, but the shadow of fear and a silence that would soon be followed by the end. The spring of the year 453 was drawing to a close, and Attila, having returned from his final campaign in Italy, was at the pinnacle of his power. His empire stretched from the Carpathian Mountains to the Rhine River, from the banks of the Danube to the Black Sea steppes. The Eastern and Western Roman empires paid him tribute, submitted to his ultimatums, feared his wrath, and tried to cater to his whims. Even when he retreated, as he did before Rome, he was not considered defeated, for his very life was already a victory.
But it is precisely at such moments when it seems that fear and power are subject to one man and his iron will, that history suddenly takes a turn and everything that seemed unshakable crumbles. Attila's death became one of the most unexpected and mysterious events of the 5th century.
He did not fall in battle, was not killed in a conspiracy, was not betrayed, and did not die of his wounds. His death came on his wedding night, in a tent full of wine and music. And this gave rise to a multitude of rumors, conjectures, versions, and legends that have survived for centuries. At that time, Attila was about 50 years old. According to Hunnic custom, he had several wives, each of whom was a means of political alliance, strengthening ties with conquered or allied tribes. His last marriage was to a young woman named Ildiko, likely of Germanic origin. The wedding feast lasted late into the night. Wine flowed without measure, and Attila himself, usually restrained in his merriment, indulged in the celebration. According to the account of Priscus of Panium, the conqueror was in good spirits, accepting congratulations, and the entire event was filled with ritual and luxury. When the celebration ended, he retired to his chambers with his young bride. In the morning, Attila was dead. The servants, having received no customary morning orders, waited. Noon came, then the afternoon. Silence reigned in the tent. Then the warriors, overcoming their hesitation, entered. Inside, they saw the conqueror's body, lying motionless. Ildiko was nearby. Later, in the works of Jordanes, a Gothic historian, an explanation appeared. Attila, heavily intoxicated, had fallen asleep on his back, and a sudden nosebleed began. Choking, he did not wake up. Blood filled his throat, and death came without a scream or pain. It seemed a simultaneously banal and tragic end for a man who had sown death on battlefields. However, many did not believe it. Alternative versions appeared almost immediately. Some believed that his wife might have been recruited by his enemies and had smothered Attila in his sleep. Others thought he was poisoned. There was even a theory that his death was caused by a ruptured blood vessel, a stroke brought on by a change in blood pressure and excessive alcohol consumption. All of these remained mere hypotheses. No evidence survived. Not a single source claimed that the death was violent, but no one could refute it either. Far more important than the cause of death was what followed. Attila's empire had no institutional foundation. Everything rested on the fear, authority, and charisma of one man. His sons did not possess the influence needed to govern the restless and internally divided union. Even Attila's closest companions did not recognize a single heir, and soon internecine clashes began. Attila's burial was an act of grandeur and mystery. According to legend, his body was placed in 3 coffins, one of iron as a symbol of his military might, a second of silver as a sign of his power, a third of gold as a testament to his glory. The burial site was kept strictly secret. It was said that the Huns diverted the course of a river to bury their chieftain in its bed and then return the water to its old path. All who participated in the funeral were executed so that no one could reveal the secret. None of these stories can be confirmed archaeologically. Attila's tomb has still not been found. Not a single artifact that can be confidently linked to him has been discovered. All that remains are legends, contradictory and frighteningly poetic. Thus ended the life of the man whom the Romans called the Scourge of God. He was not killed in battle, did not fall at the hand of an enemy, did not live to a ripe old age. He died on the night he was supposed to begin a new chapter of his life, and with his death, the dissolution began. When the fire in which the great conqueror's final hour had burned out was extinguished, the steppe, which had so long trembled under the hooves of his warriors, sank into a silence filled with anxiety. Not even a few days had passed since Attila's death before the true fragility of his empire became apparent. What held the Hunnic union together had no written laws, no institutions, no tradition of power transfer.
Everything was built on the authority of one man, and that man was gone.
Attila's body had not yet grown cold, and his sons were already fighting over his inheritance. Each of them laid claim to leadership, but none possessed the blend of charisma, strength, and political acumen that had allowed their father to conquer tribes not only with the sword, but also with his word. At first, the Huns tried to maintain unity. Ellak, the eldest son, was recognized as the successor, but this recognition was fragile. The numerous tribes that had previously only temporarily submitted to Attila's authority felt neither fear nor respect for the young chieftain. The decisive blow to the Hunnic Empire was struck the very next year. At the Battle of the Nidau River, the vassal peoples rose up against the Huns. They no longer wished to be tribute payers and hostages of terror. The battle was fierce. Ellak was killed in combat. The remnants of the Hunnic forces were defeated, and the power that had seemed eternal crumbled like dust. After the defeat at Nidau, the Huns no longer constituted a force capable of dictating terms. They retreated eastward to the steppes of the Black Sea region and the Middle Volga. Little is known about the fate of Ernach, the middle son. He tried to maintain control over the eastern part of the former empire, but no longer had the weight his father had carried. The last mentions of the Huns as an organized force date to the end of the 5th century. One of the sons, Dengizich, tried to regain influence and even attacked the eastern borders of the Roman Empire, but he was killed in battle and his head was sent to Constantinople as proof of victory. However, Attila did not disappear. He became not only a figure in history, but also a shadow in the imagination of peoples. Chronicles, legends, church sermons, folk songs, all of these transformed him into a symbol of destruction sweeping from the east, into the scourge of God, into a punishment sent for sins. His name was repeated in fear. His campaigns were remembered as a nightmare. His death was discussed as a mystery. And for centuries, the figure of Attila lived on in a paradoxical combination. On the one hand, he was a curse. On the other, an object of almost sacred admiration. In Germanic legends, later collected in the Song of the Nibelungs, Attila appears under the name Etzel, a powerful ruler who gives refuge to Siegfried's widow. His image in this saga is not a caricature or a demon, but a king, a sovereign, a master of fate. This is no longer the barbarian who invaded Europe, but something more, a figure standing on the border between history and myth. In the church tradition of both West and East, Attila remained a reminder that God can use even a savage to punish a civilization for its sins. When humanity forgets fear, Attila comes, monks would say within the walls of ruined monasteries. Medieval chroniclers, especially in the Latin tradition, sought to endow the Huns with demonic features. Thus, in the works of Jordanes, it was mentioned that the Huns were the spawn of the devil, born in the womb of Asia. The figure of Attila himself often bordered on metaphysical horror. His face was imagined as covered in scars, his voice a growl, his step a harbinger of disaster. None of this had anything to do with historical truth, but it created a persistent image. The descendants of the peoples who suffered from the Hunnic invasions passed down stories for centuries about the destruction of cities, about massacres, about fires that did not go out for weeks. In the folklore of France, Germany, Hungary, and Italy, mentions of a great king with a black sword have survived. For the Hungarians, however, the memory of Attila became more ambivalent. As early as the Middle Ages, the genealogies of some Magyar clans were traced back to the Huns, and Attila was depicted not as an enemy, but as an ancestor. He was credited with laws, victories, and wisdom.
Thus, step by step, the barbarian was transformed into a forefather. And yet, despite this layer of deification, the central feeling that Attila left behind was fear. Even centuries after his death, if nomads from the east appeared in the villages of the Frankish Empire, the old men would whisper, "Attila has returned." Such was the shadow cast by his life. Such was the force that continued to act even after his death. And if one asks what Attila's true legacy is, the answer is simple. Not in conquered lands, not in bars of gold, not in descendants or laws, but in the fear he sowed and the memory he left behind. A memory that turned into a myth, a legend, a curse, and a warning.